Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Tamara Thorpe and I'm the interviewer for our mentoring podcast. I am here today with Audrey Morell. She is one of the two authors of Chapter 3, Cultivating Diverse Forms and Functions of Mentoring Relationships Within Academia. Audrey is currently a professor of business administration, psychology, public and international affairs at the University of Pittsburgh in their School of Business. And she recently published a book, Mentoring Diverse Leaders, Creating Change for People, Processes, and Paradigms with Stacey Blake Bear, and is an ongoing contributor to Forbes.com and Huffington Post. So we have a real expert in our midst today. I'm really excited to have our conversation. This chapter was co-authored with Gloria Anosu, who also does research in the field of leadership development and identity, and particularly cross-cultural engagement, diversity, equity, inclusion. And she's also a professor. She's a clinical assistant professor at the Robinson College of Business at Georgia State University. She could not be here with us today, but we're very excited to have a conversation with Audrey today about the chapter that she contributed to this book. So welcome, Audrey. Hello, how are you?
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Let's just dive right into it. What inspired the work that you do, particularly the research, as well as the consulting and practical work that you do in mentoring?
So I have to tell you, I came to the study of mentoring, both on the research and also the practice side, from trying to really understand aspects of gender and diversity in all different types of organizations. And I remember this very clearly. I was giving a talk to a group and someone asked me, well, you've captured a lot of issues and problems and obstacles, but what are solutions? And it was just at that time, this would have been probably the early 80s, where we were just starting to see mentoring along with a lot of other tools before we started talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. We were talking about eliminating barriers and obstacles and harassment and discrimination. And mentoring was showing itself very early on from the research to be a very powerful tool. So my passion and my interest of mentoring is really about its connection and its clear connection from the now decades of research and decades of practice at being able to unlock the full and diverse range of talents and skills and ability and people's knowledge that we know are necessary to make organizations more effective.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Similarly, right, I have an equal passion that I was really brought to mentoring to really explore how that untapped potential that so much of our talent that is early in their career or less represented, underrepresented, or unrepresented, how do we untap that potential? And so as you have been doing the work that you have been doing in the decades of research, and then specifically in this particular chapter, you explore the different forms and functions of mentoring, particularly within the academic context, but also other settings. And so can you share with us, what does that mean, forms and functions of mentoring?
You know, one of the things that I've found as I've done this work and as I've taught and also worked with organizations is that we tend to really reduce the power of mentoring. We put it in one little box. We just think the only thing that's important is sponsorship, or the only thing that's important is traditional one-to-one mentoring. And when you really look at the research, you see that mentoring takes a number of different forms. It's one of the things that my colleague Gloria and I talk about in the chapter, from reverse mentoring to one-on-one mentoring to hierarchical to peer-to-peer to group to virtual. There's a whole portfolio of different types or different forms of mentoring. And then mentoring relationships from a relationship perspective, a relational perspective, they have different functions. Think about functions are sort of the purpose or what's driving and how that relationship itself is defined. And so form is really the type of mentoring that's involved, and function is the nature of the relationship, whether it's really about exchanging, interpersonal kinds of sharing where there's high trust, what the research tends to talk about as psychosocial functions, or whether it's more instrumental and tactical about career advancement, leadership development, which we tend to talk about as more career functions. And why that's important, and we talk about this a little bit in the chapter, is that when you're looking at particularly creating a formal mentoring program or an organization-sponsored mentoring program, you've got to understand purpose, and then you've got to align purpose with form and function. And if we don't start to recognize that we think mentoring is just this one thing, and it is much more complex, it is much more powerful than that.
So you mentioned psychosocial function. What is that?
That's really where we're starting to talk about the more interpersonal side of mentoring. You can talk about, there's a function we talk about that gets the label of counseling, where it's high trust, where you're really sharing things that are much more on the personal side. It's also sometimes where we see in some of the work that Gloria and I have done together, where identity and the struggles and the conflicts and the issue about identity and identification takes place. And why it's important to separate that is because you can have instrumental aspects for people to help you advance in the career, but when you start talking about that high trust and those psychosocial functions, that sometimes those are in a very protected and safe space where you can talk about challenging things. And you may not have a lot of those types of relationships over time because it takes time to build trust. It's built through experience. And so you can have a lot of people that might open doors and might advocate for you on the career side, but you might only have a handful of those deeply trusting where you have a safe space, a psychologically and an identity safe space to talk about challenging issues. And so we want to be able to make sure that people understand that different relationships do different things and they take different forms, and you shouldn't make a decision of one or the other. You need them all, and you need to work to develop them all. And that's why it's important to differentiate those psychosocial functions.
So in your chapter, what exactly do you want readers to take away as it relates to this idea, this thesis you have of diverse forms of mentoring relationships and their potential impact for learners and learners and professionals in academia, as well as professionals in other environments?
So I think I want them to take away many things, but if I had to boil it down to three key things, one is that there is no doubt whatsoever from the research, from my experience, both as a faculty member and in academic administration, from leadership standpoint across different types of campuses and different types of institutions, that mentoring has power. It has power when it comes to individual development, when it comes from diversity, equity, inclusion, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to leadership development. So there is documented, this is not just about feeling good and having these nice kinds of relationships. It really is one of those things that helps us to move the needle of what we're trying to do within the academy. So within the academy, mentoring should have a place, it should have a purpose, but it should also have a logic and a structure where we understand its purpose, its form, and its function. And we align that with what we're trying to achieve. I really try to help people in all different kinds of organizations, but particularly in higher education, to move beyond just a mentoring program and talk about a mentoring strategy, talk about a mentoring portfolio, to look at all of this powerfulness that we have in mentoring in its form and its various functions that Gloria and I talk about in the chapter, and to make some really deliberate decisions, to think about your institution, to think about who it is that you're trying to help or impact or support, to think about the form and the function and be deliberate and be evidence-based in how you approach this powerful tool, because it can, and we know that it will, make a difference if we use it in the right way. And so those are sort of the three key things, is for us to understand that there's science, to understand that purpose, form, and function have to be aligned, and to make sure that we're really using evidence-based approaches and not just throwing in a program.
Right. So you mentioned this portfolio. What exactly is a mentoring portfolio?
It's a good question, and it depends. It depends on what it is you're doing. At the great opportunity I had to speak at the Mentoring Institute's conference, there were all different. There were student affairs and career development and academic programs and people from different types of colleges. And so that portfolio means that you take all of this loveliness that's mentoring science and mentoring forms and structures, and you try to figure out what is it that we need. What is we need to, if we're talking about how to break barriers for women and people of color in STEM, this is the kind of mentoring solution that we need. Here's the types of mentoring resources that we need. And here's our commitment and the logic behind that. If I'm trying to look at in a new faculty development program, what can help us to be able to advance and support faculty of color, women faculty within STEM or within underrepresented types of areas, then I'm going to look at a different configuration, a different portfolio of what goes into that. And for us to stop thinking that one size is going to fit everything, it just won't work. And so I'm trying to get people to think about and to rely on the research and to make the research and practice work together to define the need, the portfolio, and how we measure its impact.
Well, that's great. So the idea is that we might create different types of mentoring experiences depending upon the purpose, depending upon the audience, the participants, and what we're trying to accomplish, so that sort of one mentoring program, as you said, does not fit all, but that's sort of across departments, across needs, we might create different types of mentoring experiences for people.
Absolutely. And not just a program, a strategy, a thinking about it, because a program is sort of sometimes can be a one-shot deal or something we replicate over and over again. But a strategy means, why are we doing this? How are we doing this? What resources and what tools are we putting into place? And how are we going to measure its impact? So it's a broader sort of set of activities and efforts that need to go into what we're doing. That's what I'm chasing with in the chapter that we wrote.
So thank you for that, because you do speak to this idea of having strategy, being forward thinking, future thinking, and you also talk about re-envisioning mentoring and re-envisioning mentoring through this idea of a social network or developmental network. So how are developmental networks or a program built around developmental networks different from how we've traditionally thought about mentoring?
Well, and I think the notion of developmental networks has come through the research that several of my colleagues and I have looked at, and it really comes from us developing better tools to be able to look at the different array or the different tapestry of relationships that people have, that they have at any given point in time, or that they have over time. And so it's trying to get people to look at all of the relationships that they have. And what I find, particularly in the academy, is that we tend to unintentionally, I think, often give this message that as a junior faculty member or as a student, you need to find that one powerful mentor that's going to do all things and everything, the myth of the perfect mentor. And what it does is it puts a lot of pressure on the mentoring relationship. And it means that the individual is under-resourcing themselves. They're really not taking advantage of the full support, the full resources, the full advocacy that many different types of relationships can have. And so if we start making sure that we're repeating and we're using this language of a developmental network, a constellation, a social developmental network, then what it does is it gets people used to thinking that I need different relationships because different relationships do different things. They provide different things. They give me access to different types of help and support. And I'm not making a choice. I just need a sponsor and that's the only thing that I need. And once I get that, I'll be okay. No, you need all of these things to help support and equip you to be able to do whatever it is you choose to do in life, in your career. So getting people to think about networks is about getting them to broaden their mentoring portfolio, if you will, so that you have a diverse array of different types of relationships that are doing different things, and that will change over time. And it stops that over dependence on one individual who's one powerful sponsor, who's going to be all, do all. We're going to like each other. We're going to get along. And I'm going to hear opera music every time we talk in the
Right.
background. And if you have that person, that's great. But there's so much more, and there's so many more options out there for powerful developmental relationships. We want people to think about it as a network.
That's great. And I think the idea, right, the mythology of the perfect mentor, it
Yes.
has a tendency, as you mentioned, to put a lot of pressure on a mentor and a lot of responsibility on a single mentor. And so when we think about, and I certainly know that I hear from folks all the time who go into mentoring relationships, particularly for mentors. I think mentors are often a little more concerned or nervous about entering into a
And they
mentoring
should be.
relationship. Right. And so what makes for a great mentoring relationship, right? If I have a diversity of mentors and ways in which I'm engaging with those mentors, what what is that common thread, or is there a common thread in what makes for a great mentoring relationship?
I think there's no one magic formula. I'll give you what I've seen as being some sort of core principles, and one of them is clarity. I think one of the things that helps is that um, when people approach me and say, "I want you to be my mentor," for what for? You just mentor me, and so I don't have a mentoring fairy dust that I could just spread on you and that it will work it all out. You have to have clarity about what you need in order for me as a mentor to have clarity about what I can provide. And so that clarity about what I need, and that evolves over time, but there has to be this drive for both the mentor and the mentee, or the mentors and the mentees, to be able to work to have more and more clarity about what's needed. And then how can I, or am I the right person to be able to provide that? I think a second thing is absolute communication. And so and communication may sound easy, but it's often challenging if someone is outside the organization. How do I understand and provide resources and support when I may not speak the language of your organization or your discipline or your department? And then people communicate in many different ways. And so it's getting a certain rhythm of how you exchange information and knowledge and share. And that also means developing some understanding about confidentiality in that communication, difficult dialogues in that communication, handling conflict as part of that communication. That's an ongoing process in any mentoring relationship, whether or not it's individual or group, is really paying attention to communication. And then the third one is about commitment. I tell people all the time when I'm helping an organization to launch a mentoring initiative, you get out of something in direct proportion of what you put into it. And so you have to have commitment. And that's one of the things, we often struggle with organization sponsored or formal mentoring programs, because people come in them and they take a passive approach that they're just going to be mentored. And so if you don't put into something, if you don't invest in it, then you're not going to reap the benefit at the same level as those who are committed. So I think it's really having clarity. I think it's working and the ongoing, sometimes challenging work of communication. And it is making sure that you're always reassessing your level of commitment. If you're not getting something out of the mentoring relationship, I check your level of commitment first before you point a finger at the mentor.
Yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate that. And I think that I know that as folks go into having mentoring relationships, sometimes the mentor and mentee aren't aligned on purpose and function. So that clarity, gaining clarity, really is so key, and that ongoing communication. And I know one of the things that we have a tendency is we tend to underestimate or rarely talk about miscommunications and the communication challenges that can come up in a mentoring relationship, and how important it is to plan for all of those different types of communication you mentioned, right? And troubleshooting and conflict resolution and problem solving, those are all a natural part of those mentoring relationships, and ensuring that both parties have a shared commitment, right? And are both really connected on what that commitment is. So And so when those things are working, we see that there are some benefits, and you've highlighted um, a lot of the benefits to mentoring, but I want to hone in on some of the, you talked about three emerging perspectives in mentoring, particularly mentoring as a buffer, mentoring as social influence, and mentoring as identity work. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those three emerging perspectives and how those relate to the benefits you have seen of mentoring, particularly as they relate to DE&I initiatives and strategies, and how we support less represented, underrepresented, and BIPOC folks in academia and other settings.
Sure. Let's talk about those three things that we're starting to see out of a lot of the research that colleagues of mine and I have done, and this mentoring as a buffer. A lot of times, and this is one of the things that I think we've all experienced, but we didn't really have vocabulary and the research around it. That what mentoring does, particularly when you are one of few, depending on what that is, the only woman in engineering, the only person of color within the School of Business, the only first generation student, who's on your team or in your program or the like. And so what that means is that sometimes that environment we know can not be as accommodating, cannot be as supportive. It could also be in a situation in which you are in a very toxic environment. And what do we know from research is that the presence of mentoring relationships can act as a buffer, because they provide that safe space, that psychologically safe space. We even know that in a work setting, there's evidence that mentoring relationships can offset the negative impact of a toxic supervisor or boss. And so that buffer means that when you've built that mentoring relationship where there is some trust, you've got a place to go to make sense out of what's going on, and sometimes to debrief, and sometimes to be able to deal with the concerns that you have, or sometimes to be able to work out and discuss strategies about how to navigate it. And so that notion of mentoring as a buffer is one of the things that I think is we really should pay more attention to, because it is such a testimony to the asset that mentoring is, particularly for people of color or people who are in underrepresented categories within their organization. We also know from some research that I've done, particularly with looking at leadership development, that as you're trying to understand who I am in this career path, in this new role, in this leadership role within this organization, and how I can do that and still stay true to who I am for myself, requires identity work. This notion of how do I see some integration, see some melding, see some connection between who I am and what I stand for, and what I'm being asked to do in a leadership role as a representative of the organization, in the profession, and the like. And that identity work I've seen a lot in some of the leadership development programs that I've helped to design and follow over time. And so what mentoring can do, and we've seen this a lot in some leadership development programs. We've even seen this in some of the research about ethical leaders. What does that mean? How do I see myself, and how do I communicate who I am as a leader that wants to have an impact, but it wants to also pay attention to ethics and social responsibility, diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, and the like. And so how can I understand that for myself? And how can I clearly communicate that to others so that they see that that's who I am? So it's an awareness of who I am as a leader, and the ability to be able to communicate and to be authentic about that to others. That's the identity work. And both of those are important for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And remind me, there was a third thing that you wanted me to talk
The
about. I got so
mentoring as
excited.
social influence.
Yeah, there's this thing that we know from decades of research called social capital. Some people call it relational wealth. And the best way I can explain it to you is I will sometimes tell with students, I'll say, I'm going to refer you to someone who might be interested in a particular career path, and I'm going to have you meet one of my colleagues. And I want you to understand that I am, making this introduction, and they're willing to talk to you because of the relationship that this person and I have built. And so I want you to know that I am loaning you my reputation, my social capital. And I want you to really take care of that, because you go based on my relationship with that other person. So, and so there are some scholars, and in my own writing, we talk about the borrowing of social capital. And so that's what these social networks, these social relationships allow you to do, is to be able to borrow, or to leverage, to be able to have access to the relationships and the credibility that peers or mentors or other people have developed, and they give you access to those so that you actually benefit from those relationships that you may not have created, but you've been invited to, and they're being shared. You're sort of borrowing that capital. And
Mhm.
so that's the importance of those social networks. And I have to tell you, it's where I find some of the most powerful effects of peer-to-peer mentoring is in those social networks. I often tell this story about a group of students that formed this group called Share the Candy. That was what they called it. And they promised that while they were in school, that they would collaborate and help each other on projects. But when they graduated, they would stay together. And as they advanced in their careers, if there was opportunities that they thought would fit with each other, they'd reach out and share the candy. Now that was 20 years ago, this group of students. Can you imagine where they are in their career?
Mhm.
And if that social network stayed together, and if they collaborated and shared resources and advice and opportunities, can you imagine the power of that social network now 20 years later, and what they've been able to do as peers rise together?
That's fantastic. That's fantastic, right? It is so powerful, right? And I know when I'm talking to folks about mentoring, they're never really sure what is my role, what role I can play. I've heard so many times from, executives way up in the C-suite say, "Well, what do I have to offer?" And sometimes, you can forget through your own journey, how impactful the social capital is that you've attained can have for others, and the power that um, you have, and how that can be a buffer for folks as they try to navigate. And I know so much of the work that I do today is very motivated by having worked in a toxic work environment, and my role as a mentor in that space of trying to make it safe and productive workplace for people on a daily basis when there was so much toxicity happening. And unfortunately, that was a long time ago. But to your point, so many of those relationships I still have today, and I have seen those careers progress and those individuals grow personally and professionally. And using our experience to help people explore their own identity and their leadership development is so profound. And I think it's important for people who are mentors and people who are thinking about becoming mentors, that this idea of mentoring is sort of, I'm the mentor and I know everything, and there's going to be this, younger mentor who's empty and I'm going to pour all my knowledge into them, that is not where we're at right anymore. And that there's so much power for mentors in being able to serve as buffers and support people's leadership development, and create that social influence, and helping people navigate the bureaucracy of organizations. And to your point, those peer-to-peer relationships being so powerful, particularly, I don't know, sometimes we think, oh, in higher ed, things are this way, but the more I explore, whether you're a small nonprofit, higher ed, or a huge, corporation, those same dynamics occur where people struggle to navigate the culture, the bureaucracy, and advance through the ladder. So I
So I have to
think
tell
that
you, I don't just study this, but I do it. I still work with and interact with my very first undergraduate research assistant that worked with me in 1988. He's now CEO of a large healthcare system within the region, and we've collaborated on a number of projects and things that we've done. We've actually published together. My very first research assistant that I worked with when I first moved to the School of Business, that would have been in 1989, 1990. She and I still work together. She owns her own counseling initiative. We've done a number of projects together. And my very first doctoral dissertation, Jared, we published a number of articles together. He's still at the University of Pittsburgh. He's a full professor. We do a lot of work and consulting together. And so if you look at relationships as powerful and important capital and resources that you pour into and that you receive, then I think you manage them, and you manage them as an asset that only gets better and only increases over time. And so that's that power of that social network.
Yeah, thanks for that, because that is what is, I have a tendency too often that we talk about the benefits or outcomes of mentoring as they sort of relate to kind of outputs that, organizations are going to care about at the end, reduce attrition, increase retention, increase satisfaction, all of that kind of stuff. But there's so much power in the relationships, not just in the moment, but beyond the mentoring experience. And certainly I know that's why I do it. The research just seems to, come with it. It's that the added bonus of wanting to better understand these really powerful experiences that I certainly had when I had mentors that shaped my future, and becoming a mentor that has an impact on other folks.
And as I tell organizations, it's not, the research is important because it's not what I think, it's what I know. It's what I can show you. I can show you the data, and I can show you the data from different industries and different organizations and different institutions, which that reputation is about research rigor. And so that it's not some one-time, one-shot thing. We can show this over and over and over again from the decades of work that I and many of my amazing colleagues have done, that there is power in mentoring, and particularly a unique space that mentoring plays in the context of diversity, inclusion, and social equity.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I, in my own DE&I consulting work, talk with clients all the time about mentoring. And I know for an institution or organization that has never done a formal mentoring program, that can seem daunting. And so what advice do you have for the program manager, program coordinator who is thinking, okay, I'm gonna build this mentoring program? What advice do you have for them?
So the first thing, and this is a process that I take people through when they ask me for my advice and help and guidance. And the place where I spend the most time is getting people to really be clear about purpose. And so purpose sometimes mean, particularly within a higher ed context, is that you may think mentoring is important for this one thing, somebody else may think it's important for this. And so getting whatever is the leadership team or the person who's sponsoring or wanting to do this all on the same page about what is the purpose. I did this with when I was head of the undergraduate business program at the University of Pittsburgh. We uncovered a disparity in the rate of participation of African-American students versus other students, and the likelihood that they would study abroad. And so we saw that in the data. And so we started to have this conversation and was talking to students and looking at data and all kinds of things to be able to understand, what the issue was. And there were a couple of things that pointed to a mentoring solution. And so we had to sit down and get clear about the purpose, that here's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to use one mentoring program to solve everything. We have a purpose, we have a tool. And so we're matching the purpose and the tool together. And you've got to be really clear about what that purpose is. And I find if we don't get the purpose right, everything else behind it is more complicated, and it's going to be less effective. And so what is that purpose? And are we all on the same page? And what we don't want is, let's just do some mentoring stuff. Mentoring is important. Let's put in a program. For what? Is it for retention? Is it for leadership development? Is it for inclusion? Is it for, trying to be able to help early onboarding? Is it for research? What is the purpose? And making the process and the tool align with the purpose. But you can't do that unless you've had significant conversations about purpose. And it's also the thing that we're the least tolerant. We're just like, we want a mentoring program. Come in and design a mentoring program. Well, why do you want a mentoring program? Because mentoring matters. Okay, so what are you trying to achieve? I just need some mentoring. Not a good reason to develop a mentoring program. I don't care what the organization is. And so once we're all on the same page about the purpose, what is it we're trying to achieve, then we can start talking about the how. Is it a group mentoring, or is it peer-to-peer? Is it reverse mentoring? Is it individual? Is it hierarchical? Is it a combination? Virtual mentoring, will that work here? Will it not work here? One of the pieces that I did was based on a program that I and some colleagues and I created, which was kind of a hybrid version. We called it interorganizational formal mentoring. So it was sponsored by a professional organization. It had a peer-to-peer component with peers outside of the organization. And it also had a senior hierarchical mentoring relationship, all in the same program. And we called it interorganizational formal mentoring. And so to really unlock all the different ways that you can pick from this amazing portfolio or toolkit of mentoring, but you can't pick if you don't understand the purpose. And then you've got to be clear on what's the target outcomes, because you've got to, in some way, be able to measure. And that doesn't always mean a survey. It can mean talking to people. It can mean them sharing their stories and tracking the outcome. In that program that I mentioned, we actually did focus groups. We collected some survey data. We looked at all kinds of outcome. We put in a peer-to-peer mentoring solution because of what we heard were the barriers for students, particularly African-American students in this particular case, wanting to study abroad. And we knew that that would be helpful. So we put in peer mentors, and then we measured the progress over a 5-year period. And we saw a dramatic increase in the level of participation because we got rid of financial barriers. That was part of it. But we also got rid of the identity and the relational and the knowledge barriers. And we did that in a way that was going to be less threatening and more relational, and did some identity work, which was peer-to-peer. So we've got to be clear about purpose and why. And then structure and the type of mentoring has got to align with it. And then we've got to measure outcomes. Because measuring outcomes is not just about publishing or proving that you did something. It also helps you understand how to improve and how to continue over iterations to be able to recalibrate and rethink. So we hit the mark, but you can't hit a mark if you don't define it and you don't measure it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Audrey. That's so that's phenomenal, right? There's one, as somebody who's been working in international education for a long time, I have spoken with lots of folks about how do we break the barriers to create more opportunities from students from diverse backgrounds to participate in international exchanges and study abroad, and that there is a clear, right, disparity, right, in the difference of who travels and who travels abroad, who studies abroad, as well as, right, in the corporate space, who was accepting and taking and succeeding in international posts, and knowing that mentoring in your particular case had an impact, and all the places we know it has an impact. It really is something that can help open doors to new experiences and new opportunities for folks who may, because of their own experience and background, something can feel, an opportunity can feel inaccessible. And mentors really can kind of demystify and make things more accessible so that people can really benefit from those new opportunities and experiences. And knowing that when we're putting together a mentoring program, that having that purpose informs the process, and that we're going to know we were successful when we're really clear on what we want the outcomes to be, so that we can measure them. So that's great. I think for someone getting started, it is important that before you jump in, to spend time thinking about what do we want it to achieve, how are we going to do it, and how are we going to know that it was successful. So as we wrap up our conversation, I'm wondering if for you, when you're thinking about mentoring programs, is there anything that you believe is a must-have?
The must-have, if we're talking about more formal organization-sponsored mentoring programs, they have to have champions. They have to have champions, and it's one of the things that in the past several years that I've really pushed individuals who might be the person sponsoring who or initiating the mentoring program to really think about. And those champions don't have to be the person who's responsible for the administration and the design and the execution, but they've got to have champions. They've got to have people who do the invisible work. And this is very specific to organization or institution, or, sponsored types of programs. And institutions can sponsor formal and informal kinds of programs, but it needs a champion. And sometimes those champions are the people who gave the endorsement and the support and the resources to make that program happen. But the best champions are the people who have gone through it, and they can be the ones to be able to share their story, the impact. And I don't think we leverage that. And so one of the things that I've pushed organizations and programs that I've worked with over the past several years is to be able to think about who are the champions, who are the ones that together with you are going to make the case, both formally and informally, and in an ongoing way, that are going to matter, and to get it into the vocabulary, to get it into the awareness, to help people, even if they aren't a mentor in the program, to understand why this matters. Because if we don't do that, people from the outside think, oh, this is just one of those cutesy things that looks good on the website and it doesn't have power. But in organizations and on our campuses, when people talk about things and they communicate the value, there's this concept that my marketing colleagues talk about, the stickiness of a message. And that message becomes sticky when people champion it, when people talk about it. And when they talk about it, because I know that this helped me. I know that this is one of the things that made a difference. I know that this relationship here helped me as the mentor and not just the mentee. When they talk about that, then people get to understand its value. And so those champions, I think, help to not only share the history and the story, but they also are the ones that help to communicate the value of mentoring. And so that it becomes part of the institution's DNA, so that it moves from just being this thing that we do in student affairs only, but that student affairs champions something that impacts career services, that impacts academic, that impacts research, that impacts alumni engagement, that impacts faculty to student engagement. And so in order for that to become sticky and for it to actually impact the organization overall, it needs champions. Mentoring needs a champion. It needs someone that understands its value from both a research standpoint, but from people who understand it from a personal standpoint and who are willing and able and enthusiastic about sharing the mentoring story, the personal mentoring story for them.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you for that. And is there anything that is nice to have, but if you don't have it, you shouldn't let it slow you down?
I think it's always nice to have. I really am more and more starting to see the power of peer-to-peer mentoring. I think that if you don't have a senior person, access to the most powerful dean, professor, vice president, person in charge of all things important, if you don't have access to that, don't feel as if you've lost, because you haven't. And I have to tell you, throughout my career, I really not had those powerful senior level sponsors. It to me has always been the power of peers, peers who've helped me, peers who are now in fabulous positions and continue to help me. So if there's one thing, everybody talks about sponsorship and you need that senior powerful person. And honestly, a lot of us, for women and people of color, don't get access to those people. That doesn't mean you're out of the game as a student, as a professional, or as a leader, because there's power to peers. I've seen it in my research. I've seen the power of peer-to-peer mentoring in my own experience. You are not left out. You just have to take a different route.
I love that, because and you also, because you share that in your chapter. So folks, in chapter 3, Audrey does articulate, right, that we can achieve more mentoring and peer-to-peer relationships just by fact of sheer volume, right? Which to me was so powerful in this idea of sharing the candy, right? That is where there's an opportunity in those peer-to-peer mentoring relationships. So that's fantastic. And are there things that you see in your work that people get caught up with in terms of, when I'm building a mentoring program, I have to have this thing that's actually something they can live without?
I'm not sure. I think it varies depending on programs. I think one of the things that that I'm starting to pay attention to in my own work, and both in terms of mentoring design and research, but also in terms of advising other people, is to not rely so much on satisfaction with the mentoring relationship as a metric of effectiveness. I'm starting to get more and more convinced that it's the wrong measure, it's the wrong metric, because a colleague of mine and a graduate student and I are working on a piece about mentoring and innovation. And innovation is sometimes difficult. It's sometimes struggle. It's sometimes not fun. It sometimes requires some conflict in order to push through something that nobody's ever done or seen before. And so learning is also challenging. Learning is part of innovation in higher education. Some of my most powerful mentors and faculty advisors pushed me in ways that made me uncomfortable, that challenged me. They called me on the carpet, as we sometimes say. They corrected me when I was going in a wrong direction. And none of that is going to be measured by satisfaction. None of that sometimes is going to feel good. But I got to tell you, when I look back over the years, it was some of the most powerful advice, some of the most challenging experiences that created growth, some of the ways in which people pushed me and stretched me that had the biggest impact. And so I'm really starting to challenge my thinking and others about overusing satisfaction as a measure of mentoring effectiveness. I think we're going in the wrong direction there. So that's what I'm going to be thinking about a lot in the next semesters to come, is moving away. I know we like student satisfaction measures, but learning sometimes doesn't make you satisfied, but it makes you think.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I don't want to mess with anything you've just said because it's so perfectly powerful. I think those are some phenomenal takeaways for folks to think about, for program coordinators or managers who are building out programs, even if you're in the middle of a program, taking the time to ensure that your purpose is aligned, that there's clarity in those relationships, but also that you're looking at where all the opportunities for mentoring can occur, whether it's between, those senior folks or our peers. But I encourage all of you to go deep into chapter 3 and looking at the diverse forms and functions of mentoring relationships. Certainly, I know for me, as I was reading through it, it was great to really kind of see the different types of mentoring relationships articulated, to see how powerful mentoring can be when we're looking at DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, and then how important it is to have a strategy and a portfolio. So I thank you so much, Audrey, for being here today, for sharing your wisdom in the book and with us here in the podcast. Thank you very much. And I'll leave any closing words for you before we leave folks today.
Well, I want to thank you for making this so much fun that the time flew by. I really want to thank my colleagues at the Mentoring Institute for including me in this amazing project. It was a little bit scary when they first reached out to me about the different layers. And as I saw the pieces come together and got to see the other incredible authors in that volume, and got to attend the mentoring conference and give a keynote address, all the pieces came together. And they have just been such great sponsors of this. And I just want to thank them for giving me the honor to be part of this amazing work.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.